what I'm going to talk about today is about the birth, the history, and the evolution of IVF, in vitro fertilization or test tube baby, as most of you might be aware of. And along with that evolution of IVF, how my character was shaped, my career was made, and the life lessons that I learned along my journey, this is what I'm here to share with all of you. So let's get started. It's a very interesting topic, from sparks to movement. And my story begins in the year 1322, and I don't know how miraculously the second two has disappeared from the slide. I guess Christ didn't like the last two, maybe. But it's a small town called Darfur, and that's in modern-day Sudan. A young lad has just lost an equestrian race event, that's a horse racing event, to his best friend. He's terribly upset. He's dejected, he's despondent, and he knows for a fact that he would have won the race had it not been for that brilliant stallion that his friend owns. He wants a stallion similar to that one. But he comes from a very poor background. His father is poor, but this guy is only dreaming of the stallion and the next race that he needs to win. He thinks about it for a few days, and then he comes up with an idea. And best friends are supposed to be those that say, yes, come, let's do it. Let me see how I can help you. So he went to his friend with this idea and said, look, I come from a very poor background, but I want a horse like yours. I don't have the money, but I think if the mare in my father's stable can mate with this stallion of yours, I can have a horse like yours in the near future. The friend looks at him disgusted and says, get lost. That's not happening. Go earn your money and get yourself a horse. This young lad won't give up. So he thinks about it for the next few days. And then one day, in the dark of the night, he stealthily enters his friend's stud farm and manages to collect the seminal fluid of this stallion. He rushes back to his own farm, takes a ball of cotton, soaks it in this seminal fluid, and impregnates the mare in the hope that she will get pregnant with what little experiment he's done. He says a little prayer, and lo behold, 11 months later, because that's how long a horse's pregnancy is, 11 to 12 months, this mare gives birth to a beautiful colt. And his experiment has come to fruition. So this is what it is, the envy, the desperation in this little lad's mind ignites a spark unknown to him, which will in time to come become a massive revolution in the world of assisted reproductive technology as we know it today. His is the very first instance that has actually been documented about what he did. Come to think of it, our scriptures tell us that the Pandavas were born by the grace of Indra, Yama, all of these gods, because they came and blessed Kunti and Madri. And what was that technique that these women got pregnant? It was donor sperm insemination. That is how they got pregnant. But these are stories that have been told to us over the generations. This is not something that is written down. So therefore, the reference we have as a written document is that of this young lad which was then adapted and adopted by all the horse traders in the region to increase the number of strong horses that they would have in the future for trading purposes and, of course, for races. 400 years down the line, Professor John Hunter in England takes a cue from this memoir and reports the very first human birth with the use of artificial insemination of sperm. He also describes a few characteristics of the sperm, and thereafter it starts a wave. There's a whole load of scientists through the Renaissance period that start working on reproduction, the biology of it. They look at lower mammals, the mice, the rat, the hamsters, the cats, dogs. And it's only in the early 1900s that scientists hit upon the human egg. And they start describing the characteristics of this human egg. And start thinking, what if? What if we could play God? What if we could fertilize this human egg outside? But in those days, it wasn't easy to get human eggs out of living individuals. So it took time to work on this concept. And then 1968 is a totally magical year. Magical because a young scientist from the Cambridge University, Bob Edwards, decided that he was definitely going to work on this concept of fertilizing the egg outside the body with the human sperm. But he was a scientist and he needed eggs, so he teamed up with his friend in Oldham, Manchester, Dr. Patrick Steptoe, who was a minimally invasive surgeon. And it was Dr. Steptoe's job to recruit healthy young women for surgery, laparoscopic surgery, get their eggs from the ovaries, hand them over to Bob Edwards, who would then try and fertilize it in his lab. 1968 is also magical because in Mumbai, a young girl was born and she would aspire to take forward the legacy of Bob Edwards and Patrick Steptoe. After a lot of failures, trials, and with the whole world calling the duo mad, crazy, people trying to play God and manipulate creation, they gave the world the first test tube baby, Louise Brown, in 1978 on 25th of July. What is not known to the world is a few months later, India had its very own test tube baby, Durga. But the pioneering efforts of Professor Mukhopadhyay were washed down the drain because people called him mad. People said, he's a con man, he's cheating, he's trying to manipulate things. People never took him seriously. But the truth remains that India had its very first IVF baby the same year as the world had it in England. Today, there are more than 9 million IVF babies across the world. And I remember in 1978, the news of this IVF baby was broadcast across all the radio stations. Television was a rarity in those days, so it was the radio that people listened to. And my father, who's a gynecologist, said, this is indeed a boon for the infertile couples. The 10-year-old me thought, oh, how wonderful, babies being created in a test tube. That means mummies don't need to have a big bump in front of them and walk like a duck for 9 months. Well, it was only later when I became a student of medicine and took up gynecology that I realized that it was only the first part, the fertilization, that would happen in the test tube. The mother still would have to go through those 9 months of pregnancy because that embryo needed to be transferred into the womb. But this aspect of science was truly fascinating because here was your chance to actually see how you could create life physically as human beings And this fascination got the better of me, and I decided that I wanted to be a super specialist in this area. As against the India of today, in the early 1990s, when I aspired to become an IVF specialist, the knowledge, the technology was privy to only a select few, who were themselves learning and experimenting and weren't prepared already yet to impart this knowledge to the next generation. I realized that I had to get out of my comfort zone, from my well, and go somewhere else to acquire this knowledge. The thirst for this knowledge was huge. And so I decided to approach this specialization in the UK. In those days, Britain did not recognize Indian training, Indian exams, and Indian medical qualifications. So I had to write my exams from scratch, which was okay, because I wanted to get to my goal. Once I did my exams, my name was put on a waiting list which was 2 years long. But that was okay because I was doing a job as a lecturer in Mumbai, so I said I would wait. But then when destiny has it for you, it presents itself, it manifests itself in weird and wonderful ways. I was at a conference in New Delhi in 1995, and I was standing in a lunch queue in the middle of the conference, waiting to pick up my lunch packet. The queue was very long, and there was a gentleman right behind me, a gentleman of Indian origin, but spoke with a very clear British accent. And as we got talking, he asked me, "Young lady, where do you see yourself 5 years from now?" And I said, "Sir, as of now, I aspire to be an IVF specialist." He smiled and he said, "Oh, that's very interesting. Do you have your resume on you?" And I said, "No, sir, I don't." He said, "Well, this is my address. When you get home, please send me your CV." In the 1990s, there was no email. At least in the 1995, I did not have a computer. So when I got home, I printed my CV and I sent it in the first class post. A month later, I got a letter from the Royal College because, of course, I was on the waiting list put forward by the Royal College to get to England. And of course, I should have been waiting for 2 years, but I got a stinker of a letter from the Royal College saying, "Dr. Manisha, your name is on the waiting list, but you have secured a job on your own. How did you do that? That's not allowed." But Mr. Sharma from Southport says that you are the most appropriate candidate for the job that's coming up in his hospital. And he wants you for that job. I couldn't believe it. I was shocked, I was excited, and I was a little bit upset because, when someone tells you off, it's not very nice. But in my mind, I thought, here I was jumping a queue and I was being told off for that. But then, on second thoughts, this job was not even on the market yet. So if someone thought that I was suitable for a job, because he might have actually interviewed me in that queue, which I hadn't realized, and he's given you the job, then you just grab this opportunity with open arms and take a leap of faith, because you haven't jeopardized someone else's chances. This was always waiting for you. So although it was an opening in a small district general hospital in the UK, it was my entry ticket into the UK, which I would have otherwise waited 2 years. I was working as a senior lecturer in Mumbai at that time when this job offer came, and when I went to England, I had to go back down to the bottom of the ladder to start from scratch, as though I did not know a word of obstetrics and gynecology. And that was the first lesson I learned, that if you are going somewhere to seek knowledge and skills, it's okay to start from scratch. Don't let your ego get the better of you. There were many clinical situations where I thought, I know what needs to be done here. I can do it better than what they're doing. They're faffing. But I learned to keep my mouth shut and see how they approach the problem, because there is always room for more knowledge. And the more you see, the more you learn, and that helps you innovate to make it better for a patient. So, the first thing I learned was see everything, but it is not necessary to open your mouth and blurt out when it is not asked of you and not required. But never forget to ask pertinent questions, because only when you ask questions do people also start thinking and they come up with answers, questions that they may have never thought about. What amazed me the most was senior clinicians in the UK did not hesitate to ask their juniors, what would you do different in this situation? Their ego did not come in the way. They asked questions so that eventually the holistic treatment plan would make it better for a patient. So never let your ego come, or your status in any organization come in the way of asking your colleagues, how can we make it better? Now that's a very crucial lesson that I learned in the UK, and communication is an absolute key. When you go to a foreign land, and many of you here will go, and you should go, because you must broaden your horizon and you must see what the world is doing at large. Remember, you're competing with the locals who think it is their right to a particular position. And when you want to acquire a position purely based on merit and hard work, you need to work 4 times harder. When I went for my first super specialty interview, one of the questions I was asked was, you are an Indian. You already have a 1 billion population. Why do you want to learn IVF? Do you want to just let the population burst at its seams? Aren't you worried about your country that is full of poverty? I was annoyed, because this is not the question that they should have been asking me. They should have been asking me, this was a question this wasn't in my books. I was upset, I was irked, but then I said, sir, yes, my country has a population of 1 billion, but assuming that 30% of this population is aspiring to be parents, and we know from statistics that 10% of the population is infertile, that is the segment I want to cater to. That is the segment I want to fulfill their hopes, their aspirations to become parents. So no matter what your detractors say to pull you down, stay focused and never lose sight of your goal and keep working towards it. The journey to achieve your goals and aspirations is never easy. It's like a roller coaster ride. And if you have the backing, like I did, of my spouse, of my parents, who never stopped encouraging me, the ride became that much more easier. I had my dark moments, the lowest of lows, but every word of encouragement helped me move forward. It was 5 years after I made entry into the UK, 5 years, when I got my first break into the field of reproductive medicine at the Leeds General Infirmary, under the tutelage of 2 absolutely brilliant people who taught me the ABC of IVF as I know it today. They also gave me an opportunity to do a postdoc in my favorite subject, the polycystic ovary syndrome, which a lot of you in the audience, young audience, will have heard of, which you know as PCOD, PCOS. And that was my postdoc thesis. I also got the chance to publish so many original research papers and work with genes. When I saw the DNA for the very first time, I was so super excited, and I thought, oh my goodness, life in a test tube, this is what it is. In 2005, I became a super specialty fellow at the Bone Hall Clinic in Cambridge, the very place where Bob Edwards had created the world's first IVF baby. It was a moment of absolute pride and honor to be under that very roof, to train as well as to treat women who came to the Bone Hall Clinic for their fertility aspirations. With all this knowledge that I had acquired, I was deemed fit to be appointed as a consultant in a university teaching hospital in Manchester. Something that a lot of brown-skinned people didn't get in those days, so I was truly honored to be selected and have a job that was tailor-made and designed for my skills and my talent. And so many years had gone by. I had arrived in England with 2 suitcases. Now I had a family with 2 kids. And just when I thought, yes, this was all settled and I'm here to stay, life has different plans. In 2011, my husband and I got a calling from India. It was time to move. Change is a constant. One never knows what is there in store for you. But if you let go of your apprehensions and anxieties and accept the change and trust your skills and abilities to make it happen wherever you go, trust me, that's the first step towards success. What's also important is that it's not just your talent and your skills, but your ability to break down barriers and to adopt and adapt to the new people you encounter, embrace their culture, their way of life. And here I was in Bangalore in 2011, not knowing the place, the people, and the language. So I had to start from scratch. I had to learn Kannada, which was a truly exciting experience. Success doesn't come overnight, and what is important for all you young minds sitting here is always keep hold of your core values, your upbringing, your morals, and your ethics. Do not compromise on that when you are working and looking for success. You can still succeed with good morals and ethics. So when I came to India, I realized that in the National Health Service, in the NHS in the UK, I had a department ready-made. The equipment in the lab was all there. The team was there, everything was there, patients were there. When I came to India, I had absolutely nothing, but I had the opportunity to design a unit for the very first time, procure the equipment that would be correct for the Indian climatic conditions, and then hunt for the right talent mix that would become a part of my team. I didn't have patience at that time when I came, so I was free. I was free to do all of this and train my team as well, because most of them were generalists. And slow but steady, we set up the department. The important thing that I learned is that the attrition rate is extremely high. And people are always jumping from job to job. But if you want to retain your core team, which is talented and skilled, you need to value them, you need to respect them, and you need to listen to them. It's only then can you come together and holistically make it better for your patients. And did I fail when I came to India? Of course I did. The first 3 months were terrible, where I did not have a single successful outcome in any patient. I would have almost given up, but then there is something inside you that says, never say never. It will happen. It will definitely happen. And I continued and I persevered. And I realized that success can be attributed to everybody, but as the team leader, you must take failure on your head solely. Never let your team feel low because we did not succeed, but you must come back to the drawing board, do a root cause analysis, and see how you can make it better. What went wrong, and what could we do better for that patient and for the next patient that comes in through the door. And to be honest, despite being a super specialist in IVF, I failed to get my dog Kiara pregnant. And she remains a virgin to this date. When you think you're at the top of the pyramid and you think you know it all, I don't need to do anything. I am the queen. I have it all under control. You must remember that knowledge and technology is advancing very fast, and you must keep your skills upgraded, because otherwise you stand to lose and people will go ahead of you in the race. And therefore, from the point where I was doing embryos that were transferred on day 2, day 3, and day 5 of culture in India, I did not need to go abroad. In India, I learned the art of hatching an embryo in the lab so that its sticking potential in the womb would increase. I learned how to do laser for the embryo shell. From the point where we were taking out a single cell from the embryo to test whether the embryo has genetic abnormalities, I learned the art of non-invasively screening embryos so that you can transfer healthy embryos into a woman's womb, giving her a realistic chance of a healthy baby. The slides have gone. The next thing is I'm a gynecologist and I have surgical skills. So from being a laparoscopic surgeon in the UK, I had to upgrade my skills to robotic surgery. And at the age of 50, I got myself admitted into the Amrita Institute once again in India to train for robotic surgery skills. So age is no bar to acquire new skills and knowledge. And this time round, India is so advanced that today I work with the best robotic system in the country to give my patients a better outcome and a faster recovery. Artificial intelligence, as you know, has made inroads into the field of IVF as well. You must have read recently in the newspapers that a baby was born in Mexico, and do you know how this baby was created? Through remote intelligence in the US that allowed for the selection of the sperm and the egg in Mexico, remotely fertilized, and then this baby was transferred into the mother's womb, and that gave birth to a baby. So artificial intelligence has crept into our specialty as well. And we welcome this, because at the end of the day, we are here to make it better for patients. When we try to play God, if there is a higher intelligence that is going to aid in our efforts and minimize the human error, why not? The Charak Samhita says how one chooses, in having the best baby, so that the next generation is superlative, better than you. It's Supraja. And taking cue from there, today with CRISPR technology, we can edit genes in the human genome. So you can cut a gene that you don't like and paste in the correct gene that you think needs to be in the place. So I won't be surprised that in the near future, I will have parents knocking on my door asking for these designer babies with the superior intellect, athletic skills, blue eyes, blonde hair, this height, and all of those things. And I hope I'm still, doing what I'm doing to see that day. And when I dreamt as a 10-year-old that moms need not carry a big belly in front of them and walk like ducks, now that is going to become a reality in the near future, where these fertilized lab embryos will be transferred into a nurturing pod. And babies will be reared and nurtured in these pods and gift wrapped and handed to parents 9 months later, or maybe even earlier, because we may be able to fast forward the process. It may be time where I do not need to put my patients through difficult hormonal protocols and put them through injections and put them through a procedure to collect eggs and sperm. I may just be able to take a skin cell and convert the skin cell into whichever cell I want, whether it is an egg, a sperm, and just bring about fertilization. I might start creating human clones. The future is exciting and scary, because here we are, humans, with all our problems trying to play God. The bottom line, I know, is only one: that never stop dreaming big. Never stop working hard and stop believing in what you aspire to do. And when you dream big and when you work hard and you believe in miracles, you can actually make these miracles happen. I am eternally grateful to all my teachers, my parents, my husband, my beautiful children, my extended family, the people who believed in me, the people who backed me, and most importantly, my patients who have always given me tremendous love and loads of blessings to do what I do best. Thank you so much for a patient hearing.